Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Caitlin Kelly, Assistant Director of Community Initiatives at Community Services for Children. Welcome to the Parent Project Podcast. This work stems from our vision for an engaged community where every child thrives and every family succeeds. CSC has been serving families for over 50 years, and we know that parenting can be hard. We are inviting local doctors, teachers, counselors, social workers, and other experts to provide perspectives to help parents maneuver the sometimes challenging role of parenting. Joining us today is Missy Wise, Assistant Director of United Way Training Initiatives. Missy is a social worker focused on educating, advocating, and empowering individuals, families, and communities. Thanks for joining us. We are so happy to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Missy, I know a lot of your work focuses on trauma-informed care. Can you explain a little bit how trauma impacts a child's behavior and their ability to regulate emotions?
Absolutely. So what we've learned over the years, particularly through the research around adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, is that trauma really impacts the development of a child's body and a child's brain. And as a child grows and develops, that can have lasting impacts on their behavior and their ability to really regulate those emotions. The bigger the survival piece of the brain gets as the child is growing, it starts to kind of hijack some of those other pieces of the brain, like cognitive, social, emotional, or regulation. And it can be harder for a child to kind of manage some of those pieces because of the impact of that trauma on their behavior.
So what are some signs that they may be experiencing some dysregulation due to trauma?
So every child is going to be different in how they exhibit and experience trauma, and dysregulation can show up as a lot of different things. I think typically when we think about dysregulation, we think of those behaviors around kind of acting out, being angry, being loud, not being able to follow directions. But dysregulation can also look like withdrawal. It can also look like getting quiet. It can look like not participating in things. Another piece of it is really when emotions come, having the child be able to understand and handle those emotions. Trauma really impacts that. So for a child who's trauma impacted, a dysregulation might look like a really big emotion around not being able to have the toy they want or have the snack they want, right? It seems like a response is a little bit out of proportion to kind of what's happening, but that could be a sign of dysregulation within the child.
Those are some really great points that I feel like people might not know unless, they're surrounded by children all the time. How can parents and caregivers build stronger connections with their children to help them feel safe and supported?
So I think the first piece of this really is building that safety and trust with the child. And safety and trust looks like a lot of different things. When we think about safety, a lot of times we really focus on that physical safety piece, but the emotional safety is also really important. Having the child understand and know that they are safe with the adults in their life and they can express themselves and be themselves in that safe place is really important. Trust is important as well. So being consistent, being transparent when working with kids is important. Following through, right? Not just saying I'm going to do something and then not doing it. And that can be really harmful to a child. The other piece of it is relationships, really building healthy, strong relationships. We now have new research around something called positive childhood experiences. And one of the positive childhood experiences that we always like to highlight as part of Resilient Lehigh Valley is relationships. Relationships can be key to healing. And when we create relationships with people, we allow them to have the space to talk and the space to be able to express themselves. And the other piece of relationship is really listening, and not just kind of the regular listening that we do every day, but really practicing active listening when we're working with children to really hear what they're saying, to be able to really identify what their needs are.
Great. So what are some effective de-escalation techniques that caregivers and professionals can use in these difficult situations?
So we really lean into Dr. Bruce Perry's 3R technique when it comes to regulation. So the 3Rs are regulate, relate, and reason. So we have to start at regulating the child's body and their brain, kind of calming them down. So that could look like breathing or mindfulness or blowing bubbles or spending time in the cozy corner, going for a walk, a lot of different types of techniques to be able to regulate. Then once the child is feeling regulated and their body is feeling calm, we want to relate with them. We want to use our relationship with them to acknowledge and validate their experiences and their feelings that they're having. reacting. The final R stands for reason. And that is when we start to talk to the child about kind of resources or consequences or next steps or what maybe they learn from the situation. A lot of times, professionals and parents go right to that reasoning piece of things. And what we know from development is when a child is kind of dysregulated, they're in their survival brain. They're not really able to reason. And so that's why it's important to regulate, relate, and then get to the reasoning part. The other piece of de-escalation that's really important is calming yourself first, right? A lot of times parents and professionals, we kind of react to situations instead of taking time to be able to respond. So really being able to regulate yourself before going into the situation, and then being mindful of your tone, your nonverbals, all of those are important pieces of the de-escalation process.
Thank you for sharing that. Self-regulation is definitely a big piece. How do these strategies contribute to child abuse prevention?
So I think these strategies are helpful when professionals and parents can truly understand trauma and the impacts of trauma and how it impacts the brain and the development. I think they have then a better kind of foundation to be able to build off of and how they're going to respond to their child. And I think responding instead of reacting is key. And being able to kind of take that breath, take that moment to understand where this behavior is coming from, where this child is kind of coming from, how trauma may have played a part in that, or even kind of where you as a parent or a professional are coming from can be really helpful in being able to not react right away, but really being able to respond. And as we build relationships with kids, with families, parents, caregivers, and even as professionals, we can then support each other through kind of difficult and challenging times. So people don't feel alone in certain situations. Sometimes it's just providing support. Sometimes it's providing resources. But when we have a community that can work together towards prevention, I think that's really helpful.
Parents aren't perfect. So what are some common mistakes that adults make when trying to de-escalate a situation with a child?
So as I previously mentioned, I think a lot of us, parents, professionals, just people in general, we go right to kind of reasoning in situations like that. Stop, calm down, don't do that, what's wrong, all of those pieces. And what we know from brain development is when a child is dysregulated, they're not able to think in those ways. Their brain is not able to kind of process and function in that way. And so we as parents, we as professionals kind of go to that. And then when the child doesn't respond, we get even more frustrated. And then we get frustrated, then the child gets frustrated. And then it kind of just builds and kind of escalates the situation. So really understanding the brain and being able to understand, we have to start with that regulation piece for ourselves and then for our child, I think is really helpful.
Great. How can schools and childcare providers create trauma-informed environments that promote regulation and connection?
So I think the first piece of this is really being aware and learning about trauma. Having people come in and speak like myself or other organizations, holding events like this Project Child event to bring awareness to trauma, I think is the starting piece. Once we've become aware of that trauma and started to develop our kind of trauma-informed lens, we can then use that to be able to create spaces where people can kind of show up, whether they're parents or kids, and feel safe, acknowledged, validated, and then also creating those environments for our staff and our professionals as well is really important because trauma impacts all of us, right? And so recognizing that piece, I think, is important as well. And then looking at kind of policies and procedures for kids. Are they trauma informed, right? If a child is having behavioral issues in class, what is the process for that? What does that look like? Is it a reactive process where we're going right to kind of consequences? Or is it more of a responsive approach where we're thinking about like kind of what's going on with this kid? What supports might they need? What else might be going on here that we're not really seeing? And being able to kind of take that approach, I think is really helpful.
What advice do you have for caregivers who struggle to stay calm when a child is dysregulated?
First, I would say acknowledge that it happens, right? It is hard at times to stay calm when a child is dysregulated because it kind of brings up stuff within us, right? And so I think the key to that is really understanding and prioritizing your own self-care. So really knowing kind of like, what can you do to calm yourself first? And having some practices and things in place before situations kind of happen. So when they do, you can kind of say, okay, I'm going to take my deep breaths now before I go and speak to my child or before I respond to this situation. I also think being able to take time to have self-care, right? Parents are managing and juggling a lot of different things. And so finding little spaces where you can kind of refill your cup is important, because you're going to need that for when you have to kind of step in and handle some of these situations. So if we're already kind of stressed out, that can make it harder for us to be in a space to be able to respond to things.
Self-care is so, so important. Can you share with us a success story where connection-based strategies helped a child through trauma-related challenges?
Yes, I can share a story that actually was shared with us from one of our trainings that we went to. It was a student in a classroom, and the student was kind of struggling repeatedly with kind of learning new things and focusing and concentration. And they had tried all these kind of different strategies, and nothing seemed to be kind of making a difference. And then one of the guidance counselors actually came in and really sat down with the child and actually had a conversation with them about what was really going on and what they were kind of going through. No one else had really taken the time to do that before. They had kind of just implemented these strategies and these ideas that they thought would be helpful without really checking in with this child. And this child was old enough to be able to kind of make decisions and give their likes, their dislikes, and talk about what their feelings were and what the situations were. And so once that guidance counselor was able to really sit down and have that conversation, start to build that relationship, that safety, that trust, and have a better understanding of kind of the trauma the child was experiencing, they were then able to really put in specific strategies that worked for that child and worked for where they were and for their situation. So one of the strategies that they put in place was when the child was starting to kind of feel overwhelmed, they were able to kind of put their head down and just kind of have some quiet time and be able to take some deep breaths and stay in that position for as long as they needed. And the teacher would be okay with it. They wouldn't kind of call that out or bring attention to it. They would just know that that was that child kind of self-regulating. And when the child felt that they were ready, they could put their head back up and kind of rejoin the classroom session. And so it wasn't anything that kind of was disruptive to the class. It wasn't anything that kind of called the child out specifically, like having them leave the classroom, but it's something they were able to do there. And through practicing that and through that relationship with that guidance counselor, they were really able to start to manage some of the challenges and help the student be a lot more successful, which all leads into those trauma-informed strategies of really relationship, connection, and learning about the experience of the person.
That's an amazing story. It's really great to see how these techniques and strategies really do work for parents, families, and caregivers. Thank you so much, Missy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for listening. To learn more about the Parenting Project podcast, Project Child, or Community Services for Children, please visit cscinc.org.